Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 90, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. Yes, it's episode 90, only 10 episodes until our 100th episode, and that's going to be a listener question episode. So if you have something that you want to comment on or ask a question about, feel free to email me, janet@janetszabo.com. I'll be making a list of those, and we will have that for the 100th episode. I will keep reminding you as we get closer to that date. I'm not sure what the date of that podcast will be yet, but I will let you know. And we are coming up on the 2-year anniversary of the podcast. I posted the first episode on September 12th of 2023, and as we get closer to that date, I may have a few thoughts about this whole podcasting thing. In the meantime, it's the second week of August here in Montana. We're about to have a few days of almost 90-degree weather, which we haven't had yet this summer, which is unusual. Although this summer reminds me very much of what it was like when we first moved here in the early 1990s. We've been spared wildfire smoke and threat of wildfires this summer, which is a blessing. We're all drowning in zucchini at the moment. I don't know about you, but it's zucchini season here. The garden has been fending for itself for the most part this summer, but what's out there is growing and growing really well. So I've already harvested cucumbers, tomatoes, zucchini, raspberries, lots of other stuff. It's going to be time to start canning pretty soon. A couple of friends and I went to Spokane last week for a few days. We did this last year. One of my friends is a quilter, so of course we go to all the fabric stores that we can find. My other friend is a nationally known painter. She doesn't sew, but as long as we feed her a steady diet of visits to thrift stores, she's a happy camper. So we went to thrift stores and quilt stores. I added to my stash of Tim Holtz fabric. If you didn't know, I'm kind of a Tim Holtz fangirl, and I've been buying his palette collection that has been coming out at the beginning of every month. It's a different color every month, and this month was indigo. So I picked up 2 fat quarter bundles of that, as well as some yardage. I'm not sure what it's going to end up being yet, but for now it's going in the stash. I had 2 almost solid weeks of sewing time at the end of July. It was wonderful. I got quite a few things done. I made some display samples for the quilt store where I teach. I worked on that dress that was the subject of last week's podcast episode, and no, I still haven't made the finished one, but I'm hoping to get back to it. August is a fairly full month, and my sewing time might disappear for a few weeks, but then as soon as we hit September and October, I'm looking forward to getting back into the sewing room full time because I won't have to attend to the garden and do other outside activities. So that's what's been happening here. And today's episode is going to be on decorative serger and cover stitch stitches because that's what I was working on last week. I'm not sure you've noticed this pattern, no pun intended, but I tend to do podcast episodes based on what I've been working on. And I spent quite a bit of time last week working on decorative cover stitch stitches. So we're going to talk about that today. If you have a serger and are wondering about a cover stitch machine, or you have a cover stitch machine and you'd like to get more out of it, this will probably be the episode for you. Even if you don't have a serger or cover stitch machine, but you're thinking about getting one, this might help you to decide. And if you have absolutely no interest in sergers or cover stitch machines, I totally get it. You're welcome to skip this episode and come back next week. So let's talk a little bit about the history of sergers and cover stitch machines, because what I like to tell people is that sewing machines are the oldest member of the family. Sergers are the middle child. The first domestic serger was released in 1968 by Baby Lock, and Baby Lock also released the first domestic combo machine, a combination serger and cover stitch machine, in 1999, and the first dedicated cover stitch machine in 2001. And all of this is on the Baby Lock website, and I will put a link to that history in the show notes. So you might be asking yourself, what is the difference between a serger and a cover stitch machine? A serger will trim and finish the edges of a piece of fabric in one go. That's not the only thing that it does, but that's what it is primarily used for. A cover stitch machine, on the other hand, doesn't have a knife, and its primary function, especially in the industrial setting, is to hem things. Hem knit garments. If you take a look at your t-shirt, the hem on a t-shirt looks like a twin needle on the outside, but if you look on the inside, there's something that looks like a loop of thread that goes back and forth between those two needle threads. And that looper that goes back and forth between the two needle threads covers the raw edge of the hem. So you'll sometimes hear cover stitch machines referred to as cover hem machines. It's the same thing. When you have a combo machine, that's a machine that can act as a serger, or it can act as a cover stitch machine, or it can be a combination machine where you have the cover stitch portion of the machine making a chain stitch and the serger portion of the machine making a 3-thread overlock, let's say. And that's very similar to my industrial Juki, which is a 5-thread machine. It makes a chain stitch and a 3-thread overlock in one go, in one pass. And that's all it does. I can't switch it to cover stitch mode only. I can use it as a serger only, but I can only do a 3-thread stitch. I couldn't do, let's say, a 4-thread stitch. I'm pretty sure that all of the major manufacturers have sergers or cover stitch machines or combo machines or all three. My first serger was a Juki 654DE, and I still have that machine. It was a great machine. I used it for probably 15 years before I upgraded to a Bernina L860. My first cover stitch machine was a Janome 1000 CPX, and I still have that machine. I upgraded that machine to a Janome 3000 CPX because at the time I was getting my sergers and my cover stitch machines, the combo machines didn't have a great reputation. People said they were clunky. It was difficult to convert them from one to the other. So I decided that I wanted to stick with separate machines. And that Janome 1000 CPX had a lot of quality control issues. I ended up having to take it apart and raise the feed dogs and do a few other things to it. And it was always a bit of a diva when it came to making cover stitch hems. So that's why I finally decided to get the 3000. And I was very happy with that. I had that and I had my Bernina L860 serger, but I recently traded in the L860 serger for an L890, which is Bernina's combo machine. And I did that because I teach classes on that machine and I need to know how it works. And I also want to explore some of the features of that machine. And they are features that I can't do on either my serger or my cover stitch. And I'll explain why as we go along here. I don't have any show sponsors, so I try not to be partial to any one brand. I talk a lot about Berninas because I have 3 Bernina machines and I really like them, but they're the machines that I'm most familiar with. I've also taught baby lock classes, and those are fine machines as well. I do see a difference between the baby locks and the Berninas, and I liken it to people who like to drive a stick shift versus an automatic transmission. Given my choice, I would rather drive a stick shift. I enjoy driving, and I enjoy driving a stick shift. Having a Bernina is like driving a car with a stick shift because you're really in touch with what's going on with the machine, and you can fine-tune the adjustments. The baby lock machines are great for people who want to drive an automatic transmission. They don't want to have to think about tension. They don't want to have to think about monkeying around with things. Baby lock machines have what's called automatic thread delivery, and the machine automatically chooses the correct tension. So I always tell people, go try the machines that you're looking at. Take some fabric with you, try them out. You might find that you like one versus the other, and that's fine. Please don't rush out and buy a Bernina just because I have one. Okay, let's talk about the stitches. There are what I call utility stitches, and there are what I call decorative stitches. So if you have a serger, you're probably familiar with the utility stitches, which are things like a 4-thread safety stitch, or a 3-thread wide, or a 3-thread narrow. These are the edge finishing stitches, the construction stitches. They can do double duty as decorative stitches if you use decorative thread, but for the most part, they are utility stitches. When you start getting into the decorative stitches, then you're talking a rolled hem, and that can be a plain rolled hem on a woven fabric, or it can be a lettuce edge on knit fabric. You might also be thinking of flatlock stitches, either a 2-thread flatlock or a 3-thread flatlock, depending on how you have your machine set up, and a flatlock depending on which side of the stitch you're using as the public side of the stitch. You'll either get what looks like loops going back and forth between 2 threads, or you'll get ladders. And you can use those ladders to do blind hems on knit fabrics. You can also use those ladders and weave ribbon through them for decorative effects. You can use that 2-thread flatlock to make a blanket stitch on the edge of fleece, which is a lovely detail. If you want to get into some really fun stitches on your serger, you can do what's called a serger fringe, which is a 2-thread wrapped stitch that you then anchor on the sewing machine, and you release the needle thread, and the looper thread is kept on the fabric with that sewing machine stitch, which is why you have to do that. But the loops form fringe. It's a very cool technique, and it can be really dramatic. I've done it using 2 12-weight threads in the looper, and I love the way it looks. If I sound like I'm hesitating, I kind of am, only because as I'm talking about these stitches, I'm realizing that I could probably devote an entire podcast episode to each stitch. Maybe not, but I could certainly expand upon each of these stitches. So I'm giving you kind of a bird's eye view, and maybe in some future episodes we'll dive a little deeper. One of the most underrated serger stitches, I think, is called the picot stitch, and it's sort of a cross between a 3-thread narrow overlock stitch and a rolled hem. And it just makes the most beautiful edging on really lightweight or sheer fabric. So if you were going to whip up a scarf or something, let's just say you had a really sheer piece of fabric that you wanted to turn into a scarf, that would make a lovely edge. It's also used sometimes on lingerie. There is one more decorative stitch that's available on the baby lock machines. It's called the wave stitch. And this is actually a proprietary stitch for their machines. And if you have the machine on the wave setting, what happens is, and you have a different color thread in the upper and lower looper, what happens is the tension switches regularly between the upper looper and the lower looper, and it pulls the thread in one direction or the other. So let's say it's over, when I've seen it, it's over about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch. You'll get the lower looper thread will be visible and the upper looper thread won't be as visible, and then it switches. So the upper looper thread will be visible and the lower looper thread won't be as visible. Interestingly enough, the manual for my Juki 654DE has instructions on how to do a wave type stitch manually. And it has to do with manually changing the tension between the upper looper thread and the lower looper thread. And I don't want to get into trouble, so that's all I'm going to say. But it is in the Juki manual for that machine. Gail Yellen, who I happen to think is one of the most brilliant serger instructors on the planet, has something that she calls the 7-up stitch. And it forms a scallop along the edge of the fabric, and she does it by moving the stitch finger back and forth, using the little knob that switches the stitch finger from rolled hem to overlock and back. So she gets into a rhythm. She does it every 7 stitches, which is why she calls it the 7-up stitch, and moves the stitch finger from rolled hem to overlock or from overlock to rolled hem. And again, I'll put links to all of these videos and resources because I think it's much easier to understand if you can see someone doing it rather than hearing someone talk about it. But hopefully I'm giving you some inspiration or a few teasers about things that you can do with your serger besides just serging seams. I will talk a little bit about threads at the end of the podcast, but I want to talk now about using your cover stitch machine's decorative stitch capabilities. The interesting thing about cover stitch machines is that you're working kind of blindly because everything is happening on the underside of the machine. That's where the looper is getting fed, is on the underside of the machine. So to hem a t-shirt, for instance, you fold the hem up underneath and you sew or cover stitch from the top side, from the public side of the fabric. So you can't actually see the looper thread covering the edge of the fabric because that's happening underneath. And I'll tell you, when the first cover stitch machines came out, that was a huge hurdle for a lot of people. I remember being on the Facebook group for the Janome cover stitch machines and people just tying themselves into knots to figure out how to get an even hem. Some people were ironing up the fabric, some people were using knit stay tape, some people were using fusible web, some people were pinning, some people were clipping. They did come out with hemming attachments. I bought one. I didn't find it very useful. I'll be honest, I don't have any trouble hemming. In fact, I don't even pin most of the time. I just fold my fabric up. And I learned this from listening to ZD Donahue talk about it on the Sewing Out Loud podcast. She talked about using your index finger to feel the fabric where it went from a double layer of fabric in the hem to a single layer of fabric in the garment, and keeping your index finger on that transition point and feeding it between the needles. So if you remember, I said that a cover stitch hem looks like a twin needle hem on the outside, but it's got the looper on the underside that goes back and forth between those two needles. And depending on what position you put the needle in, because there are 3 possible needle positions, you can have either a 2-thread or 2-needle wide cover stitch where you have one in the left needle and one in the right needle. You can do a 3-thread where you have a needle in the left, right, and center position, or you can do a narrow where you have the needle in either the left or the right and in the center. So just by feeding the transition between those two layers in between the two needles, I can get an absolutely perfect hem without pinning, taping, anything like that. Now, when it comes to decorative stitches, again, you're working kind of blind because your decorative thread is probably going to be in the looper on the cover stitch machine. On the serger, it could be either in the loopers or in the needle, depending on what kind of effect you're going for. But in the cover stitch machine, your decorative thread is almost always going to be in the looper. Here's the interesting thing on my Janome 3000. I have a lot of trouble using metallic thread in the looper because as it comes down through the machine, it makes a very sharp left-hand turn in a metal guide. And that metal guide tends to shred the thread. So I don't typically use metallic threads in my Janome cover stitch machine. You could call it a design flaw. Honestly, I think when they were designing those machines, they weren't thinking about people making decorative stitches with them. I think the decorative stitch in the cover stitch machine has been a recent or relatively recent development and wasn't really why the machine was designed, but people like to push the envelope, so there we are. In addition to the 3-thread or the 2-thread cover stitch, all cover stitch machines should be able to make what's called a chain stitch. And if you've ever tried to open a bag of dog food or chicken feed, you know that you have to unzip the top of the bag, and that's a chain stitch. And you also know that if you unzip it from the wrong end, it doesn't unzip. If you have a combo machine that does both serging and cover stitching, you can set up your machine to do a combo stitch where you have it doing a serger stitch on the edge of the fabric and a chain stitch a little bit further in, and that chain stitch acts as a seam. If you're wearing a pair of jeans, bend down and look at the inside of your jeans and you'll see exactly what I mean, because that's how most jeans are constructed, with a chain stitch and a 3-thread overlock finishing the edge. I'm going to throw a little bit of a wrench in here. The Janome 3000 also has top cover stitch capabilities, and I'll be honest and tell you that I haven't used that on my machine, but it is a feature of that machine. And the Baby Lock Applaud also has top cover stitch capabilities. And you'll find that a lot of people who make activewear or athleisure wear like to have that top cover stitch because it mimics the kind of seam finishes that you find in athletic wear that you might buy in a store. So if that's something that you're interested in doing, that might be the kind of feature that you're going to look for, a machine with top cover stitch capabilities. My Bernina L890 does not have that capability, but I don't use it, so I don't miss it. Also, I have the Janome if I ever decided that I needed it. So now that you know what a cover stitch is capable of, let's go back through and look at each of those stitches individually and how we could use them. So we'll start with the chain stitch, and the chain stitch is formed by having one needle, usually in the center position on my Janome, but it could be one of the other needle positions, and the chain looper. So you have a decorative thread going through the chain looper on the underside of the needle plate. What that makes is a stitch that looks like a sewing machine stitch on the top side of the fabric, or the side that you're seeing as it's going through the machine. But underneath, what you get is a textured stitch. And again, if you use a 12-weight thread, I've done this with a variegated thread, and it makes a really beautiful accent If you do it with metallic thread, you can get some really cool wavy lines. You probably shouldn't do sharp lines with this, but you can absolutely do wavy lines for embellishment or accents. Gail Yellen has a wonderful Christmas stocking pattern that utilizes the chain stitch with decorative thread. Now, what can you do with the cover stitch capabilities? So we're moving from the chain stitch. We're going to add at least one more needle and possibly 2 needles. And we're going to keep our decorative thread in the looper. And here we might even double up or triple up our decorative thread in the looper. That's certainly possible. So Gail Yellen has something that she calls a stacked cover stitch. And the way she does this is to make a wide cover stitch in the first pass. And again, you can do this on straight or wavy lines, and it helps to draw the line on the fabric, on the side of the fabric that you're looking at as it goes through the machine. So she'll do the first pass, making a wide cover stitch, and that's with the needle in the left and right positions. Then she will change the thread. Let's change the thread color in the looper. And she'll move the needle from the right position to the center position, or from the left position to the center position, so that the next pass will be a narrow cover stitch, and she does it right on top of the wide cover stitch. And what happens is the narrow cover stitch nestles itself in between the stitches of the wide cover stitch. And then for the third pass, she'll move the needle to the center position or to the single position for a chain stitch and change the looper color yet again. And then do a third pass so that there's a single chain stitch in between the 2 threads of the narrow cover stitch. And she calls that a stacked cover stitch. It's absolutely gorgeous, and you can get some really decorative effects that way. You may not be aware of this, but belt loops on jeans are actually done on a cover stitch machine. There is a special attachment called a belt loop folder that takes a strip of fabric and folds it so that the 2 outside edges meet underneath. And remember, I said the chain looper goes back and forth on the underside of the fabric. That chain looper goes back and forth over those 2 raw edges of the strip of fabric, and it covers them up. And then once you've done a long strip, you can slice it and dice it into the lengths that you need for your belt loops. So Bernina came out with 3 sizes of belt loop folders, and they make strips of different widths depending on what size width you start with. Baby Lock has 2 sizes of belt loop folder for its machines. There may be some generic attachments that do the same thing. I know that when I wanted to do binding on my Janome 3000, and that's a whole nother episode about binding. But when I went searching for those binding attachments, there are generic ones available. So there may be generic belt loop folders, but if you can, I always think it's better to get the OEM parts directly from the manufacturer rather than using the third-party parts. But that's a choice that everybody has to make. So Gail Yellen took her belt loop folder on her cover stitch machine on her L890, and she put 3 decorative threads in the chain looper, and she also has an accessory that she calls Thread Fusion, which sits on your machines, on one of your machine's spool pins, and provides four additional spool pins. So if you want to do any kind of thread blending like this, that accessory makes it very easy. I have one, I've tried it, it's great. She puts the 3 threads through the chain looper and runs the strip of fabric through her belt loop folder and creates a long strip of fabric that has folded edges covered by these 3 decorative threads. And in this case, she's doing a triple cover stitch where she's using a needle in all 3 positions, and each of those needles is threaded with serger thread, and that just gives more integrity to the decorative seam. But she took that, basically what amounts to a long belt loop with the decorative threads, and she wound it around a Christmas tree form, a styrofoam Christmas tree form, and made the most adorable Christmas trees. So that's what I was working on last week, which is what precipitated the discussion on today's episode. It was great fun. I had a wonderful time monkeying around with it, and I made a Christmas tree, and now I just have to decorate it with some charms and maybe some mini lights too. I want to mention one last feature of the Baby Lock Applaud machine, and that is it has what they're calling wipers. And I haven't seen this in person, but I've watched the video on the Baby Lock website, and it's quite intriguing. They thread the wipers with decorative stitches, and they move back and forth and form something that looks sort of like a top cover stitch, but can be a decorative stitch. So if that machine is in your price range and you want a top of the line machine that does everything, that machine looks like it's got some cool features on it. I know that Deb Canham, who is an Australian designer, has done a lot of videos featuring the Baby Lock machines, and she probably has 1 or 2 at least, if not more, that demonstrate how that wiper system works on that machine. So I'll give you a quick and dirty on thread, but there's also a previous episode where I talked extensively about thread, and you might want to go back to that. I'm going to talk about Wonderful threads only because I'm a wonderful educator, and again, I don't have any sponsors. Nobody's getting kickbacks because I'm talking about their products. I'm trying to give you an unbiased review and give you information based on the products that I'm familiar with so that you can go out, and if you have favorite threads to use, then by all means go use those threads. But I'm going to be using the Wonderful threads as examples here. So sergers can use decorative threads all the way down to 8-weight thread, and that's pretty thick. That's on the order of pearl cotton. Wonderful has 2 8-weight threads. One's called Razzle and one's called Dazzle. You can also use crochet cotton or pearl cotton, absolutely. Now remember, as we go up in number in the weight system, the threads get thinner. So another thread that I use a lot, actually several threads, are the 12-weight threads, and those would be Wonderful Accent, which is a rayon thread, and I started using that when I discovered that I couldn't use the metallic threads in my Janome 3000 because it shredded them. You don't get quite the bang for the buck that you do with the metallic threads, but Accent is a great substitute. I also use Glamour, which is one of the metallic threads, and it comes in a huge variety of colors. I use that a lot when I'm doing Christmas stuff. Spaghetti is their 12-weight cotton thread. So if you want something that has more of a matte finish to it, I would choose Spaghetti. Again, those are the ones that I use most often. So any 12-weight thread, get a 12-weight thread from your favorite supplier and try it out and see what you think. Typically, again, you're using the heavier thread in the chain looper and regular serger thread in the needles. It's quite amazing to me that 3 12-weight threads will go through the chain looper in my L890. I do have to use a thread cradle to thread that machine when I'm using that many decorative threads, and that's pretty typical. And a thread cradle is just a really long piece of standard serger thread, so about 40 inches long, and you fold it back on itself so that the 2 cut ends are at one end and a loop is at the other end. And you feed the cut end, if you have an air threader, you feed the cut end through the air threading ports, and after it goes through and comes out the other end, you very carefully thread your decorative threads through the loop and pull them through so that they come out the looper. You can do this on a machine that doesn't have air threading. Probably the best and easiest way to do it would be to tie on the thread and very, very carefully and very gently pull it through the machine. I'm not sure I would try multiple 12-weight threads in my Juki serger, but they do work in my L890. I strongly suggest putting thread nets around your spools. And the thread nets go up inside the spool and then wrap up and around the spool itself. They don't just go over the spool. You really need to put them up inside the spool and then bring them out and wrap them around the thread. And they will keep your threads from tangling. They will ensure smooth feeding through the machine because you absolutely don't want the threads to get hung up as they're coming into the machine. That's going to cause problems for you. It'll damage your stitch integrity, and it might even damage your machine. And finally, I mentioned it before, but Gail Yellen's Thread Fusion is a great way to increase the number of spool pins that you have on your machine if your machine model doesn't come with extra spool pins. Some of them do. Some of them you can get the extended spool pin caddy for the extra spools, but her Thread Fusion is great. Okay, and one last thing. Decorative thread on a cover stitch is kind of like doing embroidery, and the fabric needs to be stabilized. So typically you would use some kind of fusible interfacing or maybe even fleece depending on what it is you're doing. But some kind of stabilizer is going to make your life a lot easier. Okay, I know I went over a ton of stuff really quickly. If this is something that you want a deeper dive into, let me know. I'd be happy to do that. But I think I'm going to wrap it up here. I do have one favor to ask. We're trying to get some feedback, my social media guru and I, on whether or not having an email newsletter would be helpful, just to let you know. Not even a newsletter so much as just an email saying, hey, a new episode dropped. Or for those of you who read the blog, hey, a new blog post is up. I can set those notifications up, but it's probably going to cost me something. So I want to make sure that there's interest before I do that. So if that's something that you would be interested in, look for a poll on social media. I know she's planning on putting a post up on Instagram about that. Or email me at janet@janetzabo.com and just let me know. Send fan mail, all the typical ways to give feedback for the show. I want to thank the people who've been giving me reviews and ratings on Apple Podcasts. That's fabulous. It really does help other people to find the show. Again, if you want to check out the show notes, they are at the podcast website at www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. My website is www.janetzabo.com with links to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website and also my blog where you can see pictures of what I've been working on. So I think that's going to wrap it up for this week's episode. And until next time, I hope you get to go sew something.